Imagine standing at the edge of the world. The wind cuts through you like a blade forged from something ancient and merciless. Ahead of you stretches a continent larger than Europe, buried beneath 2 miles of ice so old it holds air from a time before human memory. You are in Antarctica, the coldest, driest, most inhospitable place on Earth. And somewhere beneath your feet, according to a theory that has gripped the imaginations of historians, conspiracy theorists, and curious minds alike, lies something that should not exist. Something that rewrites everything we thought we knew about human civilization. In 2013, a team of researchers analyzing satellite thermal imaging data released findings that sent a quiet shockwave through certain corners of the academic and alternative history communities. Beneath the East Antarctic ice sheet, buried under kilometers of frozen time, were geometric anomalies. Shapes that some observers described as too regular, too structured, too deliberate to be natural rock formations. The scientific establishment offered rational geological explanations: subglacial mountain ridges, ancient volcanic formations, isostatic pressure effects on bedrock. And perhaps those explanations are entirely correct. But for a growing number of people who had been quietly piecing together a very different story about human history, those shapes beneath the ice were not a geological curiosity. They were a confirmation. A frozen echo of something vast and lost. This is the story of Tartaria. And this is the question that haunts it: what if the greatest civilization the world has ever forgotten did not disappear into the pages of history, but into the ice? Before we descend into the frozen depths of this mystery, let us begin somewhere unexpected. Not in Antarctica, but in a library. In the collections of European cartographers working during the 16th and 17th centuries, there exists a name that appears with remarkable consistency on maps of the known world. It stretches across vast territories of Central Asia, Siberia, and regions of the known East, labeled in large, confident lettering, Tartaria. Or sometimes Tartary. It appears on maps published by Abraham Ortelius in 1570. It appears in the works of Gerard Mercator, the cartographic genius whose map projections we still use today. It appears in atlases published in Amsterdam, London, and Paris. For over 2 centuries, Tartaria was not a footnote. It was one of the largest named territories on the face of the earth. And then, with a historical abruptness that still raises eyebrows in certain circles, it vanished. By the 19th century, the name had been quietly retired from official cartography. The regions it once described were absorbed into the expanding empires of Russia, China, and the Qing dynasty. Academic historians offer a straightforward explanation: Tartaria was never a unified civilization or empire in the conventional sense. The name was a broadly applied European term derived from the Tatar peoples, a collection of Turkic and Mongolic ethnic groups spread across the Eurasian steppe. The word itself may carry roots connecting it to the ancient Greek concept of Tartarus, the underworld, reflecting medieval European anxiety about the peoples who emerged from the vast, unmapped eastern territories. In this mainstream reading, Tartaria dissolves into something relatively mundane, a geographic label, imprecise and culturally loaded, applied by Western mapmakers to regions they understood poorly. But here is where the story fractures. Because a growing community of researchers, amateur historians, and theorists began looking at those old maps more carefully. And what they found, or believed they found, did not match a simple story of imprecise labeling. If you find this story as compelling as we do, now is a great time to hit that subscribe button and join a community that digs deep into the mysteries history left behind. Every week, we explore the questions that textbooks skip over. The Tartaria theory, in its most developed modern form, proposes something far more radical than a mislabeled map. Its proponents argue that Tartaria was, in fact, a genuine civilization, advanced, sophisticated, and deliberately erased from the historical record. They point to what they describe as architectural anomalies scattered across the northern hemisphere: grand buildings and cities from San Francisco to Moscow to Sydney, constructed in an ornate Greco-Roman Moorish hybrid style that theorists labeled Tartarian architecture. They argue that these buildings, many of which were supposedly constructed in the 18th and 19th centuries, are too grand, too technically sophisticated, and too globally consistent to have been built by the societies history says built them. They suggest instead that they are remnants, inherited structures left behind by a civilization that was wiped out in a catastrophe that history has suppressed or forgotten. The catastrophe, in many versions of this theory, involves mud floods, resets, or pole shifts, global events that theorists argue buried cities, erased populations, and allowed a small group of survivors or manipulators to rewrite the historical record from scratch. In this framework, the orphan children described in 19th-century orphanages across America and Europe were not the products of poverty and disease but the survivors of a depopulation event. The architectural heritage we attribute to the Victorians was, in fact, Tartarian. And the maps, those persistent, confident European maps that labeled half the known world with a name that later disappeared, were preserving the last whisper of a civilization the modern world decided to forget. Now, we want to be completely clear at this point in our story. These claims are not supported by mainstream historical scholarship. Archaeologists, historians, and geologists who have examined the evidence cited by Tartaria theorists have offered detailed rebuttals. The architectural similarities across continents reflect the documented spread of European colonial styles, the influence of classical revival movements, and the shared vocabularies of trained architects working from the same published pattern books. The orphanage records reflect the devastating social consequences of industrialization and epidemic disease. The disappearance of the name Tartaria from maps reflects the political reorganization of Asia and the improving geographic knowledge of European cartographers, not a conspiracy of erasure. But here is the thing about mysteries that refuse to die quietly: it is rarely the strongest version of a theory that keeps people asking questions. It is the uncomfortable details at the edges. The things that seem, just slightly, not to fit. Which brings us back to Antarctica. The continent we call Antarctica was not officially discovered until 1820, when separate expeditions led by Fabian von Bellingshausen, Edward Bransfield, and Nathaniel Palmer reportedly sighted its coastline within months of each other. Before that, it existed only as a theoretical concept, terra australis incognita, the unknown southern land that geographers had long hypothesized must exist to balance the landmasses of the northern hemisphere. In 1929, a Turkish naval officer named Piri Reis made headlines, not for anything he did in 1929, but for something he had done in 1513. A map he had drawn 4 centuries earlier, rediscovered in the Topkapi Palace in Istanbul, depicted the coastlines of South America and Africa with remarkable accuracy. And at the bottom of the map, curving away into the Southern Ocean, was what appeared to be a landmass. Some researchers later argued that this shape resembled the coastline of Antarctica, not as it appears today beneath thick ice, but as it might have looked before the ice formed. One of the most well-known supporters of this idea was Charles Hapgood, whose 1966 book Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings proposed that ancient civilizations might have mapped Antarctica thousands of years before its official discovery. Hapgood suggested a controversial concept called crustal displacement, the idea that Earth's outer crust could shift dramatically over the mantle, moving continents and changing their position relative to the poles. If such a shift had occurred, Antarctica might once have been located farther from the South Pole, possibly warm enough to support forests, rivers, and perhaps even human settlement. Mainstream science, however, does not support the theory of crustal displacement as Hapgood described it. Detailed analysis of the Piri Reis map has shown that the supposed Antarctic coastline likely results from distortions, incomplete geographic knowledge, or a misinterpretation of the southern tip of South America. Yet the mystery deepens with other historical maps. The 1531 map created by Orens-Fine shows a large southern continent with river systems and mountain ranges. Another map drawn in 1754 by French geographer Philippe Boich depicts Antarctica split into 2 major landmasses separated by a large inland sea, a structure that surprisingly resembles modern seismic data showing that Antarctica indeed consists of 2 major geological regions divided by a basin beneath the ice. For critics, these similarities are coincidences or the result of speculative cartography common during that era. But for supporters of the Tartaria theory, they represent fragments of much older geographic knowledge that may have been inherited from a civilization that existed long before modern recorded history. In the more expansive versions of the theory, Tartaria is imagined not merely as a regional empire across Asia but as a global civilization with advanced knowledge of architecture, engineering, and navigation. According to this interpretation, Tartarian explorers may have reached Antarctica before the continent froze, mapping its coastline and perhaps even establishing settlements there. The idea becomes even more intriguing when we look at the history of modern Antarctic exploration. One of the largest expeditions ever sent to the frozen continent was Operation High Jump in 1946-47, led by American explorer and naval officer Richard E. Byrd. The mission involved 13 ships, 23 aircraft, and nearly 5,000 personnel. Officially, the expedition aimed to train personnel in polar conditions and conduct scientific research. However, the scale of the operation has fueled speculation for decades. Some theorists point to statements Byrd made in interviews about the strategic importance of the polar regions, interpreting them as hints that the expedition may have discovered something unusual beneath the ice. There is no credible historical evidence supporting those claims. The documented records of Operation High Jump describe routine exploration, aerial mapping, and scientific observation. But the speculation persists because Antarctica remains one of the least explored places on Earth. Beneath the ice lies an extraordinary hidden landscape. Radar and seismic surveys reveal towering mountain ranges, deep valleys, and massive lakes trapped beneath kilometers of ice. One of the most remarkable is Lake Vostok, a huge subglacial lake sealed under the ice for millions of years. Scientists believe Antarctica was once a temperate environment covered in forests, rivers, and diverse ecosystems long before it became the frozen desert we see today. And this is perhaps the most fascinating piece of the entire puzzle: Antarctica was not always frozen. Geological evidence shows that millions of years ago it supported plant life in warm climates. The ice sheet that now blankets the continent developed gradually over vast spans of time. For supporters of alternative history theories, that fact leaves room for imagination. If Antarctica was once warmer, could humans, or some forgotten civilization, have lived there before the ice arrived? Most scientists would answer that question with a firm no. There is currently no archaeological evidence suggesting that humans ever inhabited Antarctica before modern exploration. But the absence of evidence in a place buried beneath kilometers of ice also means that the continent remains one of Earth's greatest unknowns. History has surprised us before. The ancient city of Troy, once dismissed as myth, was eventually discovered by archaeologists. The prehistoric temple complex Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey rewrote our understanding of early human civilization. The remarkable Antikythera mechanism revealed that ancient engineers possessed technological sophistication far beyond what historians once believed possible. Discoveries like these remind us that history is never truly finished. So we return once more to Antarctica, to the 2 miles of ice, the strange shapes seen beneath satellite scans, the centuries-old maps, and the vanished name Tartaria written across half the world in fading ink. Maybe the skeptics are completely right. Maybe the mysteries dissolve under careful scientific examination. But perhaps, somewhere beneath that vast frozen continent, the past still waits patiently to be uncovered. The ice has preserved its secrets for millions of years. And one day, when the technology exists to explore every hidden valley and buried mountain beneath Antarctica, we may finally learn whether the stories of Tartaria are nothing more than a fascinating historical puzzle, or the distant echo of a civilization the world has long forgotten.